Hey, hi everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time here letting you all kind of filter in. I can see the attendee number ticking up on my screen. While we do, I will just say a little bit about myself and today's webinar, and then I'll introduce you to our panelists. So for any of you that don't know me, my name is Scott Carey. I'm the editor-in-chief here at LeadDev, and I am going to be your host. Today, we're going to be discussing how engineering leadership is changing in 2025, and it's a really big topic that we're going to look at through the lens of a piece of research that we just did here at LeadDev for the second time, called the Engineering Leadership Report. I'm going to paste the link to that into the chat in a few minutes so that any of you can take a look. We only launched it yesterday, but you'll get a real sneak peek today into some of the key findings, but also get to hear from our panelists about what they're seeing across the industry and how the results kind of reflect their experiences. This webinar is going to last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will be heading over to the LeadDev Slack to answer any of your questions. There's a webinar Q&A channel in that Slack instance that you should be able to join. We should also have time to answer any of your questions during this session. So there is a Q&A option as part of Zoom. You can submit questions there and I will try and get to them during the conversation. If we don't, I'll move them over to Slack and hopefully our panelists can reply to you there. Cool. I can see a few more attendees coming in, but I think we will get started with some intros and then they won't miss too much. So let me start with Lena. Before Lena introduces herself, I will say that Lena has been experiencing a 3-week internet outage and is running this off of her phone. So any internet issues that you get from Lena can be explained by infrastructure problems. But Lena, how are you doing?
So many infrastructure problems. Yeah, so bear with me. It's going to be a journey for all of us for the next 45 minutes. So yeah, I'm Lena Reinhardt. It's really nice to have all of you here. I got to be involved in creating this report last year together with Scott and the team. And I'm otherwise a VP engineering leadership coach, and I've been working with a lot of scaling and especially just changing organizations for the last 20 years of my career. Change is something I'm really passionate about and also by personality not good at. And so I'm really excited to hear from all of you how the industry has changed and exchange some ideas. Josie, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I'm Josie Haynes. I'm an executive and leadership coach focused on empowering women and engineering leaders to thrive in their roles and careers, especially like how to lead in this world of AI, along with coaching. I head up engineering at a startup we just launched called SmartPin. And I've been in the industry for 25 years and previously led teams at Apple, Tile, and Zynga building large-scale consumer products. And Anil, go for it.
Yep. I'm Anil Dash. Most of my career has been sort of being in developer experience or advocating for the nerds who are making the cool stuff. Most recently, I was leading developer experience at Fastly, and prior to that, had built the developer community Glitch, where people were building apps for many years. And prior to that, it helped the team that had started up Stack Overflow. So I got a front row seat to watching everybody build a pretty amazing community there. And I've just been sort of kicking around wherever people were building interesting things with code over the years. And really, I've just sort of tried to be an advocate around how do we make sure everybody who is building with code has got a good environment in which to do so. So that's something that is sort of my very transparent agenda in being in this conversation. And what's been really interesting in looking at the insights from this report.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you all for joining. I think we've got a really good panel here with bags of experience, but also all of you the reason I selected all of you for this panel is you're also thoughtful about what's going on across the industry at large. And so I'm really excited about getting into it. Before we do, I just want to say a little bit of context for anyone who isn't aware of this piece of work. So as Lena said, we launched this report last year for the first time. together. And the reason we wanted to do this was because we were both independently seeing that there was a huge amount of change happening across the industry. And we really wanted to quantify the impact that was having on engineering leaders, so all of you. And so we went out and asked a bunch of questions around just how are you feeling about the industry, the rate of change, how is it impacting you and your work-life balance, and the way that your teams are motivated, and all these things that we can get into today. We've just posted the link to this year's report in the chat there. But overall, we saw a kind of decent amount of step change from 2024 to 2025 in the second edition of this report. We conducted this research back in March, and 600 of you got in touch. And what we really saw was that there was even tighter budgets, a really messy hiring landscape, and really rampant enthusiasm for generative AI, which were kind of all adding to the pressure on managers to do more with less, which was the horrible phrase du jour of 2024. What that kind of meant from an impact perspective was that we saw in the data that communicating change constantly, reorganizing teams, and motivating engineers became very, very important leadership skills. And the ability to hire a great team and dive into the code base yourself became less of a kind of focus area for leaders. And then in terms of some of the key findings, just to frame this conversation, we asked folks like how much they feel the generative AI coding tools were having an impact on them and their team's productivity. And the industry at large will tell you that it's a game-changing amount, but really what we saw in the research was 60% said it hasn't significantly boosted their team's productivity. Most were kind of seeing a more moderate, like 1 to 10, 1 to 20% gain in productivity. And we can get into the implications of that. 40% of respondents said their team is less motivated to come to work than they were 12 months ago, and there's a bunch of reasons for that we can get into. And then interestingly, only 5% of respondents said that their organizations had eliminated DEI programs, which really runs counter to what you'll be seeing in the news, which again is a topic that's kind of close to my heart. So let's bring the panelists in here. So I'm going to start with you, Lena, just like considering that you were so involved in the first edition of this report, like what did you notice first off when you had your first read through this report in terms of what might have changed from year to year?
Since we're disclosing biases here, I'm a systems person, and so one of the biggest questions I had last year and again this year is how have organizations changed? Because in the way I view management and leadership, so much of our work is about influencing those systems, designing them, but they also influence us. And so what was really interesting to me is that the trend in tech around the, let's say, just the overall leaning towards a good reorg as a problem-solving tool continues, surprisingly for anyone who's been in the industry for more than 6 months. And so we're seeing similar numbers when it comes to that. Last year was 66%, this year 67%, so pretty much the same. So organizations continue changing and changing very fast. And especially I think those reorgs are such a often drastic tool, but also very easily used, that it throws a lot of curveballs for leaders. I think, Scott, you alluded to some of that as well. Similar to leadership changes, around 50% of organizations saw those. The things that have decreased a little bit are both layoffs and hiring freezes. That doesn't necessarily mean companies are growing, but that ultimately, to me, paints the picture that leaders are operating their teams in areas that continue changing very rapidly. So it's a really big one for me.
Great. How about you, Anil? What were your first thoughts?
I think the high level is just the overall level of anxiety. I feel like every single one of the areas has this worry behind it, and you sort of when we would have a new technology on the scale of AI, like when we had the transition to mobile or we had the transition to social or cloud, which I'm old enough to remember, we would be excited. Look, wow, I wonder how I'm going to use this. I wonder what it's like. This is going to be opening doors in my career. I'm going to be able to capitalize on this and this is going to be opening doors to opportunity and advancement, and not how will my boss wield this against me.
Mm.
Right. And how will this, be used as a wedge to keep my wages down or to reduce the number of coworkers that I have, and that's so different to these past few transitions. And I really agree for that, especially for the early career folks. I just think it's so different than, again, having seen those transitions, in the prior times when I don't want to belabor too much, but I think that, there's a conversation now of like, why aren't people optimistic? Why aren't they
Mm.
all just cheering for the new tech? And I said, well, it wasn't being used as a bludgeon against the people who were coding against it before. When we were introduced to the whatever it was, the iOS SDK and Xcode, in the transition to mobile, it wasn't said, and if you use this well, your team is going to be cut in half. And so I think that's just such a market difference from these other here's a new revolutionary technology moments. So yeah, that's just a stark difference. And so to have early career or career transition workers to regard a new technology with this much wariness is quite different.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. I think that the previous kind of shifts of probably caused pockets of anxiety for people who work in a certain way. The people who are working on servers and things like that. When cloud came around, are thinking, oh, I've got to adapt here. I've got to pivot. Like, what do I do? Am I too old for this? But the widespread level of anxiety that this technological shift is causing is very different. And I feel like the way it's being kind of forced down people's throats because of the scale of investment that's been made, because of the pressure that it is creating, is just it's creating a whole different set of circumstances to some of those more kind of bottom up technological shifts that we've seen kind of take over the industry in the past. So yeah, plenty to think about. Jossie, what about you? What were your kind of first takeaways when you read this report?
So yeah, to dive into one of the areas of anxiety that Anil was referencing, I thought it was very interesting around the fear of job availability. And not that there aren't obviously less jobs now than there was, pre-COVID and COVID times, but what I have seen anecdotally is there is an uptick in leadership roles compared to like last year, or especially early last year, especially in certain areas. Like I've seen an uptick in like platform engineering leadership roles as well as like AI innovation roles. And yet, though, it seems like year over year, there's this fear around that job availability is going up, and so that was an interesting finding to me, and this kind of leads to this. It's a very interesting like bifurcation I'm seeing right now in the tech industry, which is if you work in big tech or one of the FANG companies, it tends to feel very like doom and gloom. There's layoffs every week, or you then work in the AI innovation space in the up and hot coming startups, and like everything's great, like salaries are going up and crazy. And I don't remember any other times where I've seen this like just wide bifurcation going on.
Yeah, there's haves and have-nots in this new market, isn't there?
Yeah.
Lena, what were your thoughts on the kind of hiring landscape? I think that that it really looks a mess from this, and I think that your anecdotal experience, talking to a bunch of engineering leaders, has probably been similar to that. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think the big thread that also for me came through in the report is that it's really hard for everyone to make sense of what's going on right now, especially because of what Anil and Jossie also spoke to, and because there's, in addition to all of that, there's a tension internally now in companies between pressure that board members, investors, C-level are putting on teams to use new technology, use it fast and whatnot, versus the teams like having doubts or seeing the limits of what it can do, and then all of that against the backdrop against what the AI companies, who obviously have incentives to sell things here, what they're promising as possible, which then feeds again into C-level expectations. And so like my impression of the hiring market right now is, I think, to tag on to what Josie mentioned, there is still hiring going on. Companies are bringing in new people. Those people aren't all just people who are experienced, ideally with 20 years in the AI space already. Like we're seeing sort of, think of a lot of traditionally overblown and blown out of proportion job descriptions again there. It's not a new thing. And I think especially in companies that weren't as dependent on the VC market, or were relatively late stage already, so had quite substantial revenue customer base, like are doing okay. And I think that's the part that just very easily gets forgotten, because the headlines all talk about the big layoffs, the ginormous changes in companies, and the walking back of new AI strategies and whatnot. But the reality is that a lot of organizations, honestly, across the globe, from what I'm seeing, are doing pretty okay. And are still bringing on people. Yes, it's not the craze that we've seen in the 2010s with just scale, scale, scale all around. And that has implications also on how employees are being treated. I think we'll get to that as well. But yeah, it's like hiring is still happening, but it's happening in very different ways. And I think especially around bringing on juniors, there's a lot of wariness right now because of the idea that, well, maybe some of those can be replaced with what AI can do. There's obviously a lot of ripple effects of that around the future of our industry. Yeah.
Yeah, we saw that in the data, like the actual kind of net numbers in terms of hiring versus hiring increases versus increases was it netted out pretty even. So there is hiring, but it's happening in different places. So like there's geographical subtleties there, there's size of company subtleties there, there's industry within the industry. So as Josie said, like companies in the AI space are obviously thriving, and companies that are being disrupted by that are not. So there's definitely a kind of a lot to be aware of for anyone who's in the hiring market right now. Anil, you wrote an interesting blog post a few weeks ago about the I wish there were four of them, but the three horsemen of the apocalypse. It's Klarna, Duolingo, and Shopify. All of their CEOs have come out and said we're an AI first company, and what that means is we are not going to hire anyone if you can not first show that AI can do that task. And obviously the implications there on more junior level roles is explicit, but I'm interested in your thoughts on what you saw in the report, but also this kind of trend in the industry of going AI first.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to sort of tease out there. I think one is there's a meta level trend here, even separate from AI, which is the separation between the narrative and reality, right? Which is that there's a story that we're being told by a vendor, by a person in management, by a investor in the technology, whatever it is, that is being asserted as a truth. And then there's ground truth that we can see, right? This tech does this, and then we're like, no, it doesn't. And that's a thing where like we used to have a and I'm not saying this in like good old days idealism say, but like, we used to have a default skepticism about a technology, which is sort of a thing that coders were known for. Oh, we're immune to marketing hype, you know. And so that's been a little bit broken, right? Is the sort of ground truth on like, does it do what it says it does has been a little bit fractured of where we get our source of truth. I mean, this is maybe a broader cultural thing, but I think this is something really, really pertinent to this conversation, because I think we're feeling that cognitive dissonance about where's our source of truth about how we're evaluating these things, because there's the little bit of like talking to our peers, we're like, this is not real, right? And then that gets into this conversation about the AI first, right? Because I think the sources of truth for CEOs, business decision maker leaders, are completely separate from the working engineers, line managers, people who are making decisions about products. Like the lived experience of people who are like reviewing code in GitHub is completely different from the decision-making process of a business decision maker. And so we're starting to see the costs of that, right? So if you are saying from the C-suite, every information source that I consume has told me that whatever AI platform we're using can just write this code, then of course we should use that and do this thing. Like it's a sort of this rational thing. I'm trying to be as empathetic as I can to a position I don't frankly have a lot of time for. That of course we should use that tool to do this, and we should prefer to do that. And then for me, like, because I've like tried to use the tools, like I just sat down and was like, can it do this job in this way? And I find them very helpful. Like I really like vibe coding is fun. I wouldn't do it for anything in production, but it is fun. And it is very helpful to have a rubber duck that can be that responsive. And you cannot make production code this way, right? Like all those things are true, right? And you can know that in 5 minutes if you've been doing this for more than 5 minutes. And so why haven't they done that is a really interesting question, but like, let's put that aside. So then if you make these pronouncements in those roles of authority, what you realize is like, what are they actually trying to do? And the analogy I drew for AI first is return to office, right? Which is like, if you had a thing that was functioning where you had whatever your workplace policy was, whether it was hybrid or some days in office or some people remote, like you had a thing that was working before. So why did you by fiat decide to change to everybody has to come in this many, I'm going to like supervise you being in your desk this many hours, right? What changed? And it was a similar situation. CEOs talking to each other, apparently in their group chats, about what they wanted to, dictate to a team. Again, generally in the absence of any consultation or data to drive it, right? Like it's an interesting thing. Like they could have said, we will do a pilot test for 2 of our work teams to see if returning to the office increases productivity in our company with these results. Like this would be a rational process. Why would you not do that? And I think the answer is they're performing for each other, for the other CEOs. And so I think the same thing is happening in this AI thing. And like, that's a broader cultural thing. Like there's a million reasons for why that's happening. But I come all the way back. I don't mean to belabor this too much, but I think I come all the way back to this. I'm like, that's a really different way of making technology decisions. And we used to say this all the way back in the 90s, like we would roll our eyes at the tech execs that would choose to use Java because they read about it in the magazine on an airplane. This is the equivalent of that.
I really hope you're enjoying this video. Do you know Lead Dev offers way more than this?
I'm a fan of the Lead Dev newsletter. I find really practical knowledge about leadership.
Then I was like, oh, there is this big community here doing all of these content, so let me figure out a little more. Let me dig in a little. What do you have?
So make sure you check out leaddev.com.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, it's too interesting a technology to reduce to making decisions that way. Let's let the people who are good at evaluating technology evaluate it.
Yeah, they seem to be that's that part, that kind of allowing people to learn in public and kind of go at their own speed seems to have gone away this time because of the pressure. And you could have just said the word capitalism and we could have just moved on. But
well, I wanted to be more
because...
I wanted to be more thoughtful than that, because I think if we can understand the incentives, motivations, and why they get there, we might be able to shift it if they're acting in good faith. Sometimes they are.
Yeah. And there's a question in from someone watching here about the longer term implications of this shift on of not hiring as many junior developers on the sustainability of engineering organizations. Josie, I was going to throw this to you because I know it's something you've been thinking about.
Yeah, and with AI, right, we have seen that senior engineers can actually leverage it very effectively as a tool to help, as Anil was saying, right? For a junior engineer, they don't know potentially what good looks like. And so it can really not help their productivity. And in fact, they could produce pretty terrible code because of it. However, we can't just not hire junior engineers. At some point, we are all going to retire. And we can't just have a world where there is no engineers left. And so I think this really comes to how do we upskill junior engineers? And often in the pre-AI paradigm, the junior engineers would maybe pair program with a senior engineer. That's how they would learn. And now, or they'd get smaller tasks. And those are things that now the senior engineers are just leveraging AI to help with. So I don't have a magic solution to this, but I do know that it is a problem if we stop hiring junior engineers. And I think one of the big things is we need to figure out, okay, if they're not being up-leveled by being mentored by more senior engineers or getting to work on those smaller problems, but still getting experience on what good looks like, how do we upskill them?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm totally there with you. Like it feels quite common sense. It's like if we don't hire junior developers, we will not be sustainable. Like that is the crux of it.
I would say actually there's one more thing that I just thought of related to that, which is a lot of senior engineers, I'm not saying everybody, but they actually feel motivated by getting to mentor others. And if we actually lean into yes, a senior engineer can use an AI to help, and at the same time, right now, motivation is not coming from increased pay and titles the way it was before. But if this is one of the aspects of motivation, could we be leaning into that?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned motivation because I wanted to get there. I thought this was such a striking finding in the report that 40% said that their teams are less motivated to come to work than they were a year before. And Lena, I remember last year this wasn't a great number either. So my question for you, Lena, is like, why do you think that managers are feeling this way? Why do you think that they are feeling anxious themselves, but then kind of projecting this onto their team, feeling less motivated than they were before?
I think a big part of it is the incentives are out of whack. Like at the moment, I think to Josie's point, like I think there is, for a lot of us, at least for me and how I think about the industry, there are questions like how will we grow people in the future and help them learn to deal with complexity and whatnot. But at the same time, the big promise that is made to a lot of CEOs is, well, you will not need any people anymore. And a lot of managers, especially I think middle management and line management, like directors and lower levels, are feeling that because they're at this tension between teams that are just tired because they've dealt with a couple of years of often really brutal and very fast changes that impacted a lot of the people around them, a lot of the way that the teams are working. Like from the pandemic onward, it's been 5 years since that started. And there's just been a lot for the teams to absorb. In addition to that, you have a lot of ambiguity with, well, will I have a job tomorrow or in the next year? What will I have a career? What will that look like? Are white collar jobs going away, as media is currently really touting as well? And like all of that gets really concentrated into how teams are operating, because it's not a very fun philosophical discussion, but it's a very real question that people are having about their ability to pay their mortgages in the next years and feed their families. And so I think a lot of managers are just at the intersection of bosses that have these very big and bold ideas about savings and productivity gains and whatnot. And at the same time, they're often close enough to know that not everything that's promised there is actually going to materialize, or at least going to materialize yet, and have to manage the teams that are worn out and that are anxious, and very rightfully and understandably so, about what all of that is going to mean, and have, in addition to that, obviously the usual pressure around delivering more with less and whatnot. And that is just, it's a really hot situation that a lot of teams are in, and it's one that's just really hard to navigate, because a lot of things that used to be motivating for people, like growing others, mentoring, or like collaborating and whatnot, all of those things are really cut down in the spirit of so-called productivity gains, that those things are very, they're optimizing very short term. I think a big part of the practices that companies are really pushing right now are not sustainable, but the problem is also that many don't care, and that just makes it really tough for managers to be in that position.
Yeah, definitely. It's not so much a question, but there is a comment in the Q&A about this. Like there's, I think middle managers by their nature typically are trapped between management and their employees, and they often feel that pressure from both sides. But I feel like the pressure from both sides has only increased. So that distance on either end has got further and further away from the middle manager. So they're feeling more isolated. They're finding it much harder to kind of keep both sides happy. And I think that as you mentioned about incentives, I often think it just comes back to incentives. And I do think that a lot of the tools that managers in tech used to have at their disposal to motivate their engineers have gone away, and they haven't been able to figure out what the next thing is. Or actually, it's just a harder thing to motivate engineers with a mission or things that aren't kind of as tangible as the tools that they had in their toolbox before. And I don't know, Anil, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think a really important part of context for all this is power, right? And one of the things that's happening across every technical context right now is a power struggle. And I think that became very obvious, in the last, let's say, 5+ years, is that coders were one of the most powerful cohorts of workers in the world, right? Like they're very high paid and very influential in culture broadly, but certainly in how the companies are running. And I think that scared the hell out of a lot of organizations. And I think they sort of said, wait a minute, what's going on here? Why are they allowed to, whether it was social protest or influencing how the workplace was going or whatever it was? And I think importantly, we're talking a little bit about that bifurcation between what's happening in a FANG company versus a startup. And also importantly, keep in mind of people who write software and code, somewhere around 12% of them are at the big startups. It's a very, very small subset, but they have an outsized impact on the culture that people feel, right? Like they set the tone for what people think tech is, right? And so at those companies, why do we have a constant drumbeat of a drip of layoffs every other week, right? It is very hard to see that as anything other than psychological warfare. Right. Like it is very, like you're telling me a company that can run a global supply chain down to the second reliably could not foresee that they were going to lay people off in 3 weeks. Right. That is impossible to believe. Right. It has to have been planned. And that's not a conspiracy theory. That's just common sense. And so at that point, and again, like they are smart people, so they know what it does to people to say that we are going to send a message out every other week to people that your coworkers are being laid off. They know, like, again, they're smart. They know what impact that has on humans. And so when you know that you're planning to do that and you know what impact it has on people, it is a strategy, And so I think that's something that we have to be very cognizant and aware of. And it's like, why would you choose that strategy? I think there's only one reason, right? Is that you're aware of the power balance and you want to reset it to what you think was the right balance. And I don't say that lightly. I think that's something that is a choice that was made by a small number of companies. I actually think it's not very many companies that want to run that way, but it's a small number of companies with a very, very outsized impact. And again, a number of leaders that have become very isolated, talking to each other about what is the acceptable way to run and what is the acceptable way to make decisions. And then because they have that outsized impact, that affects how people feel, because everybody has a colleague or a coworker or a spouse or a roommate who works at one of those companies and has been through that, or they themselves used to work at one of those companies and got laid off or whatever it is. And so that sort of carries forward. And so I think that those sort of echoes of that, ripple forward into the rest of the industry. And I think we're in the throes of that and have been, for these last several years. So even if mathematically there are roughly the same number of jobs, and even statistically, there is not that much impact of, for example, cutting back DEI programs, or, like the numbers are what they are. Like, why would the perception have changed so much about DEI? Why would the perception have changed so much about AI impact? Why would the perception have changed so much about these things? Well, companies that have enormous communications budgets and companies that have an enormous ability to predict what their staffing and hiring needs are going to be, are using the same tools that they use to promote the most successful companies in the history of the world to get another message out about how they want workers to feel.
Yeah, I think it's a whiplash inducing culture shock, isn't it? I think that the way that people feel about the industry and the way that people who work in the industry feel about their organizations and their roles has changed dramatically over in the space of just a few years. I think back to the way that the industry looked and felt before the pandemic, and it was so different to this. And you said earlier it comes down to power, and it does. At that point, the employees had more power than their employers, and so they could impose things on the organization that led to that kind of culture that we saw, and that pendulum has swung, and so the culture has shifted with it. Lena, I know a bunch of your conversations that you have with folks in your coaching roles, there's a lot of people kind of coming and just saying, yeah, okay, it's a job now, not a career. And that's the saddest thing, is that like that kind of sense of belonging to an industry that matters seems to have kind of shifted as well.
Well, I also think though that a lot of that is by design. I feel like my connection might be stuck right now.
No, you're okay. You're with us.
I'm just going to shut up and let someone else go.
All right. Well, I was going to...
All right. So yeah, I think a lot of that is by design. Like, I've just turned my video off really quick. So in that, we're coming out of a time where like transformational leadership was the model that was really promoted, and servant leadership and other concepts that are really related to it, which are really about recognizing people as individuals, developing them, supporting them with like motivating and challenging things to work on. And what I've been thinking about a lot is how much more explicitly a lot of companies have shifted back to a transactional leadership model, to like, you are here, you do work, you get paid for that. If you do more work, you get paid better. That's it. I've heard things relate to me from, bosses outright saying in meetings with their managers, like, quote unquote, I don't care about inclusion anymore. Things that, were for a very long time, yes, DEIB, corporate DEIB has always had a lot of issues, and we'll probably get to that a bit, but where now it's very outright in that, yeah, this is a trade, and sort of where in the 2010s, I think big budgets were able to mask a lot of issues that come with, well, yeah, late stage capitalism and whatnot. Now that the budgets are much scarcer, it's a very different conversation where I think a lot of people are really seeing the face that their company is really about, and how much the values on the wall really mean. And oftentimes they don't mean much at all.
Yeah, I think that the findings, really well said. And I think the findings in the report were really interesting on the DEI point that you've both raised there, which is that obviously things have shifted, and there are very, very real political reasons for that in the United States in particular. But I do think it's interesting how very quickly certain leaders who were very at the forefront of those initiatives have kind of very quickly just pivoted off them when it became convenient to do so. What I was happy to see in the report was that actually only 5% of respondents said that their companies had eliminated their DEI programs, and actually 60% said that DEI was still a priority for their organization. And so I thought that was interesting. I think that it kind of probably boils down to what those efforts look like and what that actually means in practice. But Josie, what were your thoughts on those findings when you first saw them?
Yeah, I think one of the things when we talked about this a little bit was I'd be really interested to see like the company size breakdown for those things. Similar to what Anil was saying, like, the large companies are 12% of the employee base, right? And I would say a majority of them have all seriously pulled back on their DEI efforts, and Apple being the holdout, right? Saying like, now we're going to continue, publicly saying we're going to continue investing in these efforts. But I would say that there's most likely still a lot of smaller companies where, yeah, it's still a priority. They realize that building an inclusive team is going to create a high-performing teams as well, right? Inclusion and high performance are actually directly correlated. This is something I speak about at infinitum. I mean, the Google research actually talks about this, that they did on their high performing teams. And so I think that's one interesting aspect. I think, again, anecdotally, both talking to coaching clients as well as other leaders in the tech industry, is that even if it's not officially stated that it's being cut, there's definitely less of an emphasis on it, especially on things like hiring panels and diversity in hiring and things like that. And that can be a double-edged sword in some ways. And what I mean by that is a lot of times DEI really came to being performative, right? It was really started because of things that happened in the US politically, and everyone just went back. Not that DEI hadn't been happening before, but we saw a big uptick, right? Around the time of George Floyd. And unfortunately, that also meant that it was not being implemented in the best way. There was a focus on diverse hiring without building inclusive cultures, which ends up with a rotating door. And so I think one of the reasons we're getting a little bit of a backlash is people didn't see improvement, whatever that means, from their DEI efforts, but also at the same time, they weren't really implementing it in the most effective ways. So my hope is that companies that are focusing on this focus on the inclusion point of view. Like if there's one thing to highlight on DEI is, if you're going to invest in it, do it the right way, which is the harder way. I'm not saying it's the easier way. It is the harder way, but that's what's going to move the needle as well.
Yeah. And Neil, what about you? What were your thoughts on these
Yeah, I
findings?
mean, I think I agree with all those points. I think there's, I think having been involved in the space for, a long time, certainly long before 2020, I think there is also a lot of well-earned skepticism. There certainly is a lot of, people put on a coat of DEI paint at that point, and being, member of a couple of these communities, people sort of felt like, oh, they're going through the motions. And so, I definitely have talked to people who've been like, kind of good riddance to them, stop pretending for this. And then, conversely, I think there are organizations where they have kept the effort up, but, socially, politically, or contextually felt like they can't say it anymore. I think it is like, don't ask, don't tell DEI, where they're like, we're doing the work, but we can't call it that anymore, or don't want to call it that anymore. And they're like, well, fine, we don't need to say the thing if we're doing the work. And that's an interesting evolution. I think there are people who feel like almost more grounded in it. Like if we don't call it that and we're still doing the work, that's a bit more solid. They
Kind of
don't
means
like the
more.
sense of having been forced into it. Like they're definitely resentful of like the cultural context that puts them in that position. But the idea of just doing the work for its own sake to build a better team is a great way
Yeah.
to do it. And so I
Yeah.
think that's a really maybe a silver lining amidst all the other sort of factors. But I do think there's a lot of good parts, which is like, if you're like, we're still building the best team we can all the time, and the organizations that are just responding to political whims by blowing in the wind their best people are gonna leave and come here. Like they're like, we like that all day long, like to be able to
Oh,
take
yeah.
their talent and say like, come over here where we don't just overreact to political fashion. It's a good way to bring great talent in. I think they really like that. I think the other thing that has been to the point about being a leader and executive leadership, looking at peers, if you are a manager, and you hope to be on the executive track, looking at peers who mimic the rhetoric of people in the industry because they think that's how they're going to advance, is always a tell. Where they're like, I wasn't saying this 6 months ago or a year ago, and now I'm saying this thing because I saw a guy on social media say it or whatever. It's a pretty it's a pretty wispy thing to hang your career on.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something too to sort of watch for. And I say this with a little bit of experience, is people notice. They're not dumb. Certainly your team notices. the people that report to you know they see that thing, but also management, right? Like you might think you're sort of appealing to senior people, and it doesn't. It's transparent. And so
Yeah.
I think that's one of those things too, is I'm surprised at how large a cohort, again, people in, sort of FANG adjacent spaces a lot of times are like, well, I'm mimicking that thing I saw whatever Elon Musk say, and therefore this is going to be good for me. And maybe if you're trying to get a check from a certain cohort of guys for a VC-backed thing, that does work. I'm not saying that doesn't. It works in this very, very narrow cohort, a context. But in a normal career where you are trying to manage people to be effective at creating good work, and sort of be of service to their careers and get the most out of them, and hopefully advance your own work through doing that, it doesn't work. And so like that's the other thing that's really strange to see people sort of performing that and being like, ta-da, why didn't this, why isn't my LinkedIn blowing up? And so I think that's sort of an interesting cultural moment where we're sort of seeing people just kind of mirror back this thing and expect it to perform for them.
We're almost at time there, but I want to thank you for pulling out a silver lining, because there haven't been many. And one of our questions was actually, is there something positive to be said about this shift? Have we lent too far away from innovation and become bedded into certain ways of working that are now getting kind of quite painfully blown up? Lena, what was your silver lining from this report, even if it's not aligned with that question?
It connects directly with what Daniel was just saying. I think it is still possible, and personally I also believe that it's still important to do the right thing. Just because a lot of people got into this line of work because they want to build great teams that build great products. That is still a thing that's possible. One thing that you may have to learn is how to present things in a different way. I like the sort of don't ask, don't tell. I often call it stealth mode, where you talk to the leaders above you in the organization, performance and whatnot, like the big executive worrying about the people you work with. It doesn't have to mean you stop looking how you can help them grow. You just talk about things in a different way. And I think that's a way that, like, at least I have always worked to some degree, to be honest. But it's something that works. And I think it's really important to figure out, like, where are the things where you can stay true to your values? And again, I think that's possible. And what are the areas where you can grow and learn to, maybe negotiate things differently, communicate differently. But yeah, I think it's a really important thing now.
Nice. Thank you, Lena. Jesse, what about you? Final silver lining.
I think my hope is that honestly we get to a world where we realize like AI isn't about replacing all of our engineers and engineering leaders, and that it's about supporting actually making more effective and better teams and helping. One of the things I work with a lot of engineering leaders in is like, how can you use AI to take care of all like the drudgery that is not the thing that's helping you focus on your strategy and leading your team effectively? And so to me, like, that's the silver lining, is getting to a place where we've overcome the hype that like AI is going to replace every single engineer and engineering leader. And we realize and we normalize, like, how do we actually leverage this to make effective, high performing teams that still value the importance of the human aspect of building amazing tech products?
Perfect. Great. Lovely place to end it. So yeah, we are at time. I want to say thank you all to our wonderful panelists for digging into this report and bringing their insights to a bunch of topics there. I urge all of you to go away and read the report. For any of you who are going to be at our London event next week, I'll be presenting some more findings up on stage there. Come say hi. And for anyone watching this on the stream, thanks for tuning in. But yeah, thank you all. And we will now move over to the Slack, where if any of you ask questions, we will take those over there and hopefully get to them. But one last thank you, and have a good rest of your day.